In this video, I want to pose a question to you. Is there even such a thing as what we might call the spirituality of indifference? And so last week I had a very intense, emotionally disturbing situation and felt a lot of disturbing emotions. And what surprised me is um, not that I was having them. I mean, to me, it seemed absolutely natural. I was in academia. I was a professor for 22 years and parted ways with something that I absolutely love. I love teaching, and I parted ways with that career, at least that form of it. And I had some friends of mine who commented that, come on, Chris, you've been doing this stuff for 30 years. I'm surprised. Aren't you immune to having these kinds of emotional, intense responses? And so that's what I want to talk about in this video. Is there some trick? Is there some way that we can create a spirituality that protects you from intense emotional loss? And I'll spend the rest of the video on this, but the short answer, at least from my version, is no. There isn't. And I'll explain a little bit why I think that, but also I'll get into how we're at a time now where it does seem like there's this thing called the spirituality of indifference that seems to be kind of being marketed. And so, of course, the ego always wants to cheat the game. The ego wants all yang with no yin, and the ego wants, to be able to love and feel the pleasures of love, but never feel the pain of loss. The ego wants that new Corvette, but it doesn't want to pay for it. And then in the spiritual world, you get a lot of these, so many books that have this title, like How Not to Give a F, and then it will have the rest of the letters kind of blanked out, which is a little ironic, because if you really didn't give a, you'd think you'd at least use the word. But you have to admit, if you look on any bookshelf, you're going to see a lot of these, what I call the spirituality of indifference, how to just kind of unplug your emotions, so you become almost like Spock from Star Trek, where you're just, so protected from any kind of emotional pain, and then you live a life that feels very secure with that. But in my view, this completely misses the main point of Taoist teachings. There is no such thing as a one-sided mountain. And you can't. You can, maybe the ego wants all yang and not any yin, but that's not the way the math works in Taoism. The two are connected. They're really the same thing. And so that's the human experience, is that we're getting the same thing. If you want to love, and have that very unique human experience of love, and whether you love your job, or you love your kids, or you love your partner, there's no way to fix the math. With love comes the potential for loss. And with me, if you have a passion, so maybe it's your job, and if you have a passion for teaching, if you love teaching, and when you part ways with it, you're going to have an emotional response. Now, many teachers give the impression that maybe they have achieved some level of indifference. And to the ego, of course, that's really desirable. I don't know. I agree that many teach, whether it's Eckhart Tolle, it's very hard to imagine Eckhart yelling at his cat. Or, of course, one of the main complaints, I've always followed Alan Watts, and through the years, one of the main complaints people have is like, well, and it's probably true. He probably ended his life a little shorter because of his excessive smoking and drinking. And people say, well, if he was so enlightened, why did he have this addiction that he simply couldn't overcome? So there's these human traits that seem to emerge from some of these teachers. And because we have this, and I think it's the ego has this image where we expect, there's some goal in mind, and that's where some of us are going towards. We want that level of indifference where we're so protected from emotional pain that maybe we would refer to that as enlightenment. So is there some type of spirituality that can go beyond the human experience? And maybe that's where these characters, like, machine-like characters, and, people like Spock and Vulcans that we played around with, I mean, maybe they were uh, projections of what we're imagining would happen if we could unplug our emotions. There's one scene in particular I remember from, if you remember Star Trek, if you remember the character Data, who was an android and had an emotion chip, so he could turn his emotions on and off. And after breaking up, his girlfriend broke up with him, and he put it this way. He said, "Well, is our relationship over?" And she said, "Yeah, I'm breaking up with you." And he said, "Well, then I'll delete the appropriate files." And he was, and I think as some of us, we look at the spiritual quest and our spiritual teachings as, is there some way that we can unplug the spiritual or the emotional pain, but we want to keep the emotional good. We want the love, but we want to have some way to, like Data, just delete those files when the emotional pain comes up. And so, really, there isn't any way. I wish I had some trick. And if you do, if there's some trick I've missed after 30 years of studying the East and philosophy and Taoism, Buddhism and Hinduism, if I've missed something, please share. I would really be interested in your comments, because the whole point in Taoism is they're connected, and that is our human experience. And if you shut down one, and Alan Watts put it this way, is there any way we can just get everything up? And you can't. Up needs down, and in this way, there is no positive emotion without the negative. Now, what do I do? Okay, well, what is spirituality is the way I look at it. To me, the mind will play all kinds of tricks and create all kinds of suffering of its own creations. And so that's one of the things I work on. The mind plays tricks, and you think there's some snake in the road, and you get afraid, and then you realize it's a stick. And in that way, the mind creates its own problem. So the real problem isn't the problem. The problem is that you think that there's a problem. And in this way, we can alleviate a lot of suffering. But we can't cheat the human equation. We can't, if you love your kids, if you love your job, if you love music, you open yourself up to the susceptibility of loss. And there's simply no way that you can have one without the other. Now, again, remember, it's the ego that's playing the game of trying to get all good and unplug the bad. But that's just the ego. And the ego, remember, it's this protective mechanism. It's just trying to keep this meat suit alive. But that's not who we are. And I'm going to use a word, it's filled with a lot of baggage. So, maybe I should just say the word consciousness. But I'll use the word soul. And so we look at our essence, and way beyond the social constructs of ego and the social constructs of thinking. Remember in other videos I talked about it, you don't even think your own thoughts. And we lose all those illusory ideas of who the self is, and we're left with this soul, which maybe is absolutely indescribable. But the soul is brave, the soul doesn't have fear. And that's why the soul risks love, and the soul risks making these connections, because ultimately it realizes that, as Shakespeare put it, it is far better to have loved and lost than to have never loved at all. And all these stories that the mind comes up with, that get us into suffering, they get us into our own problems. Love isn't just another story. When we talk about passion, whether it's passion for your job or the passion you have with relationships, and the connection and the deep sense of love that you have with people or your career, that's not a story. We may have stories around them, but the love itself is more of a state of awareness. It's more of a state of consciousness. It's really a vibration. And it's creating a really interesting, unique experience. And there's going to be a cost associated with it. And so, um, as human beings, I don't think there's any way to beat this game. So it's the ego that thrives for the spirituality of indifference. Um, in my take, I would say that spirituality is about absolutely embracing the human condition without fear, um, because the soul is far braver than the ego, and it knows that all the love that we can experience on this journey, it's all worth any of the pain that we'll suffer.